It's 1986, and astride an old Simpson Schwalbe motorrad, of which many trendy young people of Berlin today ride, sits a rebel. His name is Frank Lanzendorfer, yet he is more commonly known, in this period, by his not so heavily disguised pseudonym of Flansendorfer. Frank is a rebel. Maybe not so much to the eyes of the West. To the West, i.e. the lands of the west of the Iron Curtain, he probably would be considered quirky as a 26-year-old. He wants to fight the establishment in his bohemian, poetic manner, using his body as a canvas. However, the issue is, he isn't from the West. Frank is a child of the East. He was born in the communist stronghold of Dresden, a city that sits within a cauldron where the airwaves of the West cannot reach. He did his service in the Nationalvolksarmee after graduating high school, as all other men had to do. Then he did something that many young people of the East also did. He moved to Berlin. Berlin was awash by 1986 with an underground artistic community. Young people, feeling suppressed by the old men that ran the state, wished to find conduits for their expression. The young people of the country were reforming, and the old tried to hold them within the past. Flansendorfer, Frank, settled in Prenzlauer Berg, the once beautiful tenement district to Berlin city centre's north. But its once former glory is now darkened and grey. The ornamentation crumbles almost as quick as the economy of the DDR, the Deutsches Demokratisches Republik, and with it the conformity of the youth to a government they now reject. To be part of the underground was to put your freedom in danger. Whilst the DDR may not have directly murdered people because of their art, like their predecessor, the National Socialist government, they could and would throw young rebels into the notorious Hohenschönhausen prison. Yet for Frank and the young group of artistic punks to which he surrounds himself, it is a risk they are willing to take. He founds a magazine that gives a platform for young poets to publish their work, entitled Schaden or Damage. He writes for books and contributes to magazines such as Bizarre Cities, Liana, and Und. His work is contemporary and experimental. The paper on which he typed poems is not just paper but a canvas. Drawings and photographs juxtapose or complement the writings. One of the few images that survives of Frank is from a collage, a cutout of a young man placed before a window in an empty room. He is bare-chested and wears army trousers with suspenders that hang down. Around his neck there is a neckerchief. His pose is punkish, poised, ready for action. His face is chiseled, similar to a young Elvis. His hair dark and scruffy, and this is the young man who rides his motorrad. The exhaust pipe emits small puffs of blue smoke as the Simpson Schwalbe bounces along the ill-maintained roads of the berserk Frankfurt order. Here, the tall prefabricated blocks of the city of Berlin, the Plattenbau, fall to rich flat lands and dense forests of oak and pine. Thin canals drain the land and line the roads. Small villages of single-story homes slumber. A blanket of snow rests over much of the countryside. The road is treacherous, and through this Frank rides. On his back is a backpack. Contained within is some food for the day, along with something to drink, a notebook and a pen, and most importantly his Russian Super 8mm camera. The cameras weren't hard to come by. Soviet soldiers were known often to barter their wares. There was, however, always the difficulty of acquiring the film and, more dangerously, developing it. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking for as he continued on. Occasionally he would break in his journey, park his motorrad, and wander from the road. It was on one of these wanderings, as he approached Eberswalde, a small town to the northeast of Berlin, that he made a discovery. After leaving his motorrad by the road, he had wandered through some woods after catching a glimpse of something shimmering beyond. Carrying his camera with him, it was small and light and easy to conceal if someone should see him, he progressed. What he discovered was exactly what he had been searching for. Their stylistic features were carved and bold, chiseled faces, gaunt gazing eyes, but they lay beneath what Frank wanted, layers of Cyrillic graffiti. It was apparent that at some time in their history they had been painted gold. Then the Red Army soldiers of the 20th Guards, who were stationed nearby, must have decided to add their own colour. Frank took out his camera. Depressing the button, he began to record. Amongst the snow stands two great men, naked and bold. He doesn't know it, but these are Der Harald, with his right arm raised, and Berufung, which sits, gazing into the distance. Both statues by Hitler's favourite sculptor, Arno Breker. They are echoed by two monumental female nudes by Fritz Klimsch. One of the female nudes bears the marks of war. Her kneecap is missing. The holes where it used to be show the rough edges of Soviet gunfire. Perhaps it was the winter weather that allowed Frank to wander the sports field on which he had stumbled, the soldiers who would normally be occupying its space preferring to shelter in the warmth of their barracks. Frank therefore takes the opportunity to wander a little further around the cinder ash running track that lays beneath the crisp, white, and undisturbed snow. There are two further golden figures that have caught his attention. He shoots as he approaches with the 8mm camera. There ahead of him, unceremoniously placed with no thought to their surroundings or placement, are two great bronze horses. What Frank doesn't know is, as he shoots his camera, he has become effectively the first known German to look upon Hitler's horses in 40 years.
Achtung, Achtung. Hier ist die Sendestelle Berlin im Voxhaus. Meine Damen und Herren.
Welcome to Achtung History, written and presented by myself, Simon J. James, and produced by the BerlinTourGuide.com. This week, the continuation of The Hunt for Hitler's Horses. After shooting the horses with his camera, Frank Pflanzendorfer, for artistic purposes would return to Berlin on his Simpson-Schwalbe Motorrad. The footage he had captured that day, along with other footage including pieces which he had created in collaboration with the female artist Mita Shamal, he would later develop. Then over the course of the next months, slowly and carefully, edit by hand his artistic film together. Frank gave his film a title, The Eisenschneider League, and he arranged for a non-public public display at the apartment gallery of Jörg de Loch. Display to which artists and the like were invited under secrecy to view the film. There naturally was always a fear that the Stasi, the secretive police and informants of the Ministry of the State Security, would find out. But, as a rebellious artist, Frank took the risk. In the crowd that evening, the evening of the film showing, there was a woman from Czechoslovakia. She sat through the performance of the 49-minute-long film, whose visceral images were accompanied with heavy punk music, all the while holding her own camera. There was a caveat to displaying her work as an artist at the Galerie de Loch. Immediately after the show is over, all works, without exception, had to be destroyed. So with the performance over, Frank takes his film, opens the little door to the typical tiled stove found in East Berlin apartments, and he burns his work. However, the cassette recorded by the woman was smuggled out and became the only known evidence at this time of Hitler's horses. And with the tape being shown at further galleries, soon news that some striking old statues had been found started to spread. Despite the Berlin Wall that limited the free movement of the people of the East into the West, news still travelled across the border, especially with the young people who could travel across and party or eat in the East for a fraction of the cost in the West. News began to circulate more, especially within the West, that something thought lost might have been found. It is unclear if this is how Dr. Magdalena Buschardt, Today, an art historian with the Berlin Technische Universität in Berlin came to know of the hoard of National Socialist art that surrounded the sports field at the Soviet Kaserne. Dr. Buschardt, in 1989, produced a journal article entitled Überraschende Begegnung mit alten Bekannten, Arno Breckers NS-Plastik in neuer Umgebung, or Surprising Encounters with Old Acquaintances, Arno Breckers' National Socialist Sculpture in New Surroundings. It is a fascinating piece, looking at the historical context of the newly discovered statues, their historical placement and purpose contrasted with the situation in which they were currently, in 1989, located. As a cultural piece, it also caught the attention of West German newspapers, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, who, from Dr. Buschardt's work, produced a cut form of the journal article on the 14th of January, 1989. Soon the news that had been circled semi-secretively was now quite in the open. Attention towards the statues were drawn not only by art historians such as Dr. Buschardt, but by a wider audience in the West German state. Enjoying a wider audience did not mean, however, just attracting the interest of the casual reader. It also meant reaching those who were willing to capitalize on the information that had come to light. There are many throughout Germany and the world who collect National Socialist art, equipment, and other paraphernalia, either for glorification or from interest. One person who certainly had an interest was Reina Wolff. When news of the discovery of the statues reached him, and with the excellent photographs that were in Dr. Buschardt's article, Wolff contacted an art dealer he knew in Aachen, who, apparently, had excellent means of retrieving art from the East. Helmut Schumacher, a podgy, round-faced, middle-aged gentleman, manages somehow, even today, not to have a presence on the internet, the only traces being a handful of old newspaper articles. Schumacher had dealings before with Wolff, acquiring trinkets from the East and for other customers vintage cars amongst other things. Therefore, it was Schumacher that he approached. Upon being approached, Schumacher contacted someone who he had worked with before, someone who lived closer to the border and had more dealings with the East German regime and their processes, Peter Schmitz. Schmitz had built a trade on importing classic cars from East Germany, where there was no internal trade. Many classic cars, even those used by Hitler's regime, had been left to rot and rust away in barns or in the open as parts became unavailable, and the use of ownership of the cars were frowned upon by the East German powers that be. If there was anyone who knew how to deal with the East German authorities, it was Schmitz. Schmitz then, in turn, approached the news with his own contact, Helmut Stragies, a scrap and auto dealer in Oranienburg, a town that lays between Berlin and Eberswalde. So the story becomes one of a trio: Schumacher, Schmitz, and Stragies, two from the west and one from the east. It doesn't take long for Schumacher to spring into action, but his first port of call after contacting Schmitz is to a home in the suburbs of the German city of Dusseldorf. Knocking on the door, a copy of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in his hand, he waits. To the door comes an old man, face thin, bony and pockmarked, heavy-brimmed glasses held upon his considerably sized nose. He peers at the podgy-faced man before him. It's Arno Brecker, the artist of two of the recently rediscovered statues. Schumacher shows Brecker the article. Brecker nods as he reads. He then exclaims that he always had the feeling that the Soviets had taken his work, and proclaims he would like to see them return to the West. Pleased with Brecker's response, Schumacher leaves. It's now time to make a visit to the East. Armed with a padded bag of cash, supposedly given to him by Reina Wolff, Schumacher heads for East Germany. Even in the time of the war, it was possible for people from West Germany, if they wished to spend considerable time in the East if they knew the right people to contact and could get the right permissions. The East at the beginning of 1989 was teetering on falling into a deep bankruptcy. The borders had gradually been opened up to more and more tourism as the regime searched desperately for hard currencies that carried more value than their own, principally the West German mark. So with a bag full of West German marks, Schumacher entered the East and proceeded to head for the hotel that only foreign guests with hard currency could stay in, the Grand Hotel Friedrichstrasse. The Grand Hotel today bears the tacky name associated with American roadside lodgings, Westin. Yet it still maintains some of the grandeur that the East German regime had wished for when it was constructed and eventually opened in 1987. Modelled on the grand hotels of the 1920s, it was, during the time of the Berlin Wall, Berlin's only grand hotel. Its interior, not wanting to use the words too much, itself modelled off of the classic Greta Garbo, John Barrymore and Joan Crawford film, Grand Hotel, from 1932. Within the hotel there was an antique shop, operated by der Bereich Kommerzielle Koordinierung, or COCO for short. A powerful internal organisation that had been formed as part of the Ministry of Foreign and Inner German Trade, but had since become its own powerful entity, controlling over 150 trading companies and responsible for trying to limit the deficits of the DDR's balance sheets, all under the leadership of Alexander Schalk Golodkowski. In the shop there often worked a woman, whom Schumacher had come to know after making multiple visits to the East, staying in the Grand Hotel, and often having, through his purchase of antiques for wealthy clients, added some good numbers to the balance sheets of Coco. Her name was Maria Dime, and it just so happened that her husband was Hans Werner Dime, a career soldier risen to the rank of Major General and Deputy Chief of the main staff for operational issues within the Ministeriums für Nationale Verteidigung, the Ministry of National Defense. Maria was Russian-born, and therefore a native speaker of the language that people in the East had to learn, but those in the West did not. A husband who had spent the years between 1971 and 1973 at the Military Academy of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the USSR had close connections with the Russian armed forces within East Germany, and he also spoke excellent Russian. Together, they were valuable connections for Schumacher. He need not be discreet with his inquiries with Maria. It was the reason why the antique shop was there, to pawn the items of German history. However, there should be some discretion overall. There could be outrage if Communist East Germany was discovered to be financing itself from the sale of National Socialist items. And besides, this time, Schumacher wanted to keep it under the radar from Coco. So, Schumacher broached the topic of the statues, of the horses of Hitler that was stabled in Eberswalde with Maria. Then, he slipped her some cash, or rather 10,000 Deutschmarks, that could be used to grease the palms of the Soviet and East German officials alike. For Schumacher, all there was left to do was wait, to pace around the Grand Hotel for days or wander amongst the antique shops of the East to see if there were any other lost treasures for sale. Otherwise, there was little to do in the East. After a few days, Maria returned with an answer. The first steps in the inquiry had been made. The Soviet commander of the base in Eberswalde, where the statues had been located, had been contacted. However, the answer for Schumacher was not a positive one. The commander of the base was worried how it might look for the base if it came further to light that it was in possession for the last 43 years of numerous pieces of National Socialist artworks. But the game is not over. Stragis, the scrap dealer from Oranienburg, now makes his own visit to the Soviet military base. Stragis was raised in the East, but certainly did not have an affinity for its ruling party, the Socialiste Einheitspartie Deutschland, the SED. The Sed Cronies in 1972, before Horst Stragis' eyes, had put a gun to the head of his grandfather when the family lived in Felten, a small town also near Berlin, and forced his grandfather to sign over the family business to the state. Needless to say, there was not much love between Stragis and the SED, but also, it meant he hadn't fully invested in the system, and in this case he had only learnt the most basic amount of Russian required by the state. Nevertheless, Stragis made the journey north from Oranienburg to the base. His previous dealings with Schmitz, he had procured cars from across the Eastern Bloc and was well adept in the workings of the communist regimes. He had made a living off of it. He had to be persistent. He had to insist to see the base's commanding officer. Again and again he was refused access, but eventually the Soviet guards and authorities, annoyed, relented. Stragis was presented before the base's commanding officer. And he had an idea. There had been, in December 1988, just a month prior, a horrendous earthquake in the Soviet-controlled Armenia. On the 7th of December at 11:41 local time, a 6.8 magnitude earthquake shook northern Armenia. With an epicenter near Spitak, it brought devastation to hundreds of thousands and had left between 25,000 and 50,000 dead. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev returned from a planned visit to the United States in order to survey the damage himself. There was little to survey, except for ruins. Spitak was almost completely destroyed. Stragis in broken Russian managed somehow to broker the idea of a donation being made by the art smugglers to the commanding officer to help with the rescue and recovery efforts in Armenia after the devastating quake. There were certainly moments when neither one understood the other, but slowly Stragis was able to promote the idea as a goodwill cause, not as a bribe. Even with his broken Russian, he was able to portray his idea, and the commanding officer agreed to the deal. At the Grand Hotel in Friedrichstrasse, Maria approaches Schumacher. The Soviets are willing to trade in exchange for a donation he can have the statues. With some good news, Schumacher finally smiled. Retrieving a never-brown paper envelope from the safe within his room, he handed Maria a much larger sum, the donation for the Armenian earthquake. However, shortly after, Schumacher receives a phone call. It was from the car dealer Schmitz. It seems that both had been working in parallels to one another with a similar cause. Or the commanding officer had been playing them off of one another to see who would provide the larger donation. Either way, Schmitz informs Schumacher that the deal has been made and the horses are ready to go. Just a few days later, as January started to draw to a close, and whilst the berserk Frankfurt order sat once again under a blanket of snow, Horst Stragis and his brother travelled in a truck each along the narrow and ill-maintained roads. The leaf springs of the trucks bouncing heavily, with the flat bed unweighted, causing them to be thrown about their cabs. When they arrived at the base, their truck was waved straight through the gates. The Soviets were ready. The Soviet commanding officer of the base, it appears, had wished for a speedy departure for the statues that had stood unloved, unmaintained for decades, so not as to draw suspicion. One day the statues would be there, the next they would be gone. The soldiers of the base, it was fairly certain, would not question their disappearance. They weren't paid to think, and as long as the operation for their removal was done quickly and under the cover of the dark, no one else of the surrounding area would have to be any the wiser. As the truck pulled up to the sports field, a crane was already waiting for the Stragis brothers, and the statues had been lifted from the earth that had grown around their bases. The horses, however, were not in the best of shape. The tails had been torn off, and there were multiple bullet holes, as well as a slab of concrete, clearly not original, that had been poured around their feet, perhaps to secure them after they were damaged at the end of the war. A crane also waited. The trucks drew alongside. Then a swarm of soldiers set to work. Working quickly, they hoisted the horses into the air with the crane and then swung them over to the flatbeds. They had no idea how heavy they were, or if the flatbeds would even support them. Then, carefully, they were lowered. With an almighty creak, the trucks took the weight of the bronzes. A gentle bobbing of the truck cab caused some alarm, but it settled as the springs flattened out under the weight. The commanding officer made an appearance, and he handed Horst Stragis a brown piece of paper transferring ownership. Then, with the horses loaded and covered on the flatbeds, the trucks, driven by the Stragis brothers, roared into life. Into the night the trucks drove. The whole deal had been done without the knowledge of Coco and its czar, Alexander Golodkovsky, so secrecy from this point was paramount. Luckily, with the amount of Soviet troops in East Germany along with the large Volksarmy of the state, trucks moving in the night was not uncommon. In the darkness of the night there was also little to see, to suggest to the nosy East Germans that anything out of the ordinary was happening. For the Stragis brothers, a long drive was ahead of them. They needed to get to the small village of Fehlerfans, that is to the southwest of Oranienburg. There they had a secure lockup where they often stored cars that were procured for Schmitz, along with other scrap they considered valuable. So along roads that ran alongside canals that were silting over and through dense forests of evergreens they drove, until eventually they arrived in the late hours of the night before morning was about to break. The trucks reversed into the red brick storage building. However, there was now an issue. The Soviets had been able to make use of a crane. They did not have such luxuries. All they could do was dump the horses and hope not to damage them further. For Schmitz and Schumacher, the first major task had been completed, but perhaps the more difficult task lay ahead. The horses had to be moved across the inner German border, which would not be as easy. For the East German soldiers were not corrupt, unlike their Soviet counterparts. If they were to apply directly to the East Germans, they firstly might not allow the horses to leave, or they might charge a number close to the horse's value for an official state sale if they claimed ownership, which in turn would bring about a whole new range of complications and even media attention, which also in turn, if they were able to get the horses across, might lead to their seizure by the West German state and leave Schmitz, Schumacher and Wolff out of pocket. Therefore, there seemed to be only one solution. Schmitz arrived at the barn shortly after the arrival of the horses. He carried with him a box. In it was a brand new tool, a Makita-branded hacksaw. An electric tool that would help the brothers in their next task, sawing the Taurak horses that once belonged to Hitler into pieces that could be transported easily across the border as scrap. It took 4 months to break the statues down into manageable sizes, with the brothers working every day at the monotonous job. It was only the detailed pieces that were left intact. Finally, with everything broken down, the next phase of the plan could begin. Schumacher had a friend who lived on the grand Soviet-styled street of Karl Marx Alley that once bore the name Stalin Alley, but is, due to its tiled facade, commonly known as Stalin's bathroom. Here the more detailed pieces, such as heads and hooves, could be hidden in grey blankets. Stragis personally on hand to do this once with one of the other statues that they removed from the Soviet army base, a man's head, probably from one of the Brecker pieces. These larger, more identifiable pieces were to be smuggled out in a known smugglers' route, the limousines of the hard currency cocoa hotels of the East, such as the Grand Hotel, could collect guests from Berlin's Tegel Airport, that has only recently closed. These limousine drivers, it was known, would then collect Western goods and smuggle them back. Schumacher didn't see why they couldn't do this, but in reverse. Hire the limousines to collect him from Tegel, but first for them to drive to the apartment on Karl Marx Alley. Collect an identifiable bronze piece, then transport it to the west. The border guards were unlikely to check the limousine of a cocoa hotel as it left the east. As for the other pieces, they would use Schmitz and Stragis' classic car trade as cover. Classic cars would be purchased in the east and then driven by Schmitz to the west, with pieces of the bronze works in the car. If a guard asked what the bronze was for, Schmitz merely had to say it was for casting vintage car parts, and show that the bronze was itemized on the official bill of sale by Stragis, which he filed with the correct channels within the East as scrap. The pieces smuggled out by the limousine drivers had all been stored in a trailer in Wilmersdorf, in West Berlin. The drivers of the limousine had made a fortune, over 1,000 marks per trip, which would put them instead when the wall fell just a few months later. But Schumacher had what he wanted. Then the trailer was driven by a friend of Schumacher along the transport corridor that connected West Berlin with West Germany. Slowly but surely, over the next months, they were able to get all of the parts out and transport them back to Bad Dürkheim. When Horst Stragi sent out the final piece, it would be the last he saw or heard of the statues until 2015. It was, besides a team of restorers and Wolff himself, the last that anybody heard of the statues for many years. But in September 2013, an offer arrives with a former gallery owner. Edeltraud Immelzauer, former director of B&T Fine Art Limited, lives in an area of Moabit in Berlin which has seen better days. The facades of buildings once grand were stripped away at the end of the war, as being a reminder of a decadent past. Neoclassical beauty is replaced with grey and brown render. Only the entranceway and staircase, in their rich mouldings and carvings of the apartment building in Rostocker Strasse, reflects the former glory the building once enjoyed. The building itself is an allegory for her own story. Once married to a rich businessman who ran away and conned out of her remaining fortune, she, herself, had fallen on more destitute times. But still she had a hand in the art world. This is when the offer arrives. It's from a former car dealer turned art consultant. He claims that he has statues belonging, perhaps jokingly, to the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, which he wishes to sell. Interested by what is being offered, Immelzauer presses for further information. The response is that it is 2 horses by the artist Torak that are on offer, for a total cost, including delivery, of 3.1 million euros. Intrigued, Immelzauer decides to do her own research. She travels to the hideously depressing and soulless Kulturforum, a collection of buildings that on the exterior neither inspire nor delight. Here, amongst the wonderful museum collections, there is the Kunstbibliothek, the art library. She has the artist's name, Torak, and a simple description of the horses. So she finds the right period within the rows of books of the library and begins browsing. Soon she finds out that Torak was Speer's chief artist for the Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg. Then she discovers the horses. There is a well put together book. It is entitled simply Die Neue Reichskanzlei. It was printed briefly by M. Müller and Son in Munich. The other famous book they published was Hitler's Mein Kampf. The book, with beautiful photographs, is the best record we have today of Hitler's Reichskanzlei, and in it, on pages 30, 31, and 33, you can plainly see the horses of Torak, there on the terrace in front of Hitler's working room. With this information in hand, Immelzauer had the knowledge that these statues that this mysterious car dealer on behalf of a Grand Knight of the Teutonic Order was selling actually belonged, to the best of her knowledge, to the state. However, one thing that the car dealer did not know was that Immelzauer had been, and was, a police informant. She took this information to the chief art investigator of the Berlin State Office of the Criminal Investigation, René Erlonge. Erlonge had become quite famous 5 years prior for instigating the investigation against Wolfgang Beltracchi. Beltracchi had, through the creation of forgeries of notable artists to a high standard, managed to steal between 20 and 50 million euro from unsuspecting buyers. For this crime, in 2011, he was sentenced to 6 years in jail, so it can be said that Erlonge certainly had a good foundation. However, from the little evidence that Immelzauer had, the note and the information that the statues were once state property, but there was little more to go on at this point. But Immelzauer kept receiving emails, now from others saying that they were the sellers, which she continued to pass along to Erlonge. Slowly more information began to surface, and eventually a name emerged, Reina Wolff. What Erlonge did not know was that someone else had also received information on the horses. Flamboyant doesn't quite cover Michael von Rijn. His story sounds if Martin Scorsese should direct a feature film about his life. In old photographs from the 1990s, he's dressed in fine suits, a wide grin on his face, slicked back hair, and eyes that seem to be rolling with dollar signs. Michael von Rijn established himself as a trader initially in hippie jackets in the 1960s in Amsterdam, wool coats with sleeves on that he imported himself from Istanbul. It was whilst in Istanbul that he was approached by a man simply known as E. E was an art dealer and smuggler. Van Rijn had a Dutch passport. E entrusted Van Rijn to transport some Byzantine antiques back to the Netherlands, which he did, and then he sold them. Soon, E trusted him with a trip to Armenia, where police chiefs were bribed and art was smuggled out of Armenia and into Beirut. Not just any art, however, but Fabergé eggs, crates of them. Soon Von Rijn was in Russia dealing with mafia clans in stolen art, buying art whilst drunk on vodka. Yet the more he dealt, the more the authorities learned about him. Interpol was on his tail as well as Scotland Yard, who among some of its officers had a bet on how long it would be until one of the many hits on Van Rijn's head actually would be carried out. In Yugoslavia, he was chased by the local mafia. In Marbella, he was arrested by the police. But the local godfather of the mafia came to his rescue and arranged for a comfortable stay in prison in Italy rather than be extradited to France. But eventually Von Rijn flipped. He says himself that it was after going to Nigeria to buy knockheads that he changed. He was there to buy them and sell them later for millions, but to the locals the knockheads are sacred and buried with the ancestors. But in order to protect them, they have to stay awake through the night. It was meeting these people and realizing the hurt that the theft of their heritage caused that Von Rijn changed. He flipped sides. Meeting with now retired Detective Sergeant Richard Ellis, who established Scotland Yard's Art and Antique Squad, the two came to an understanding. Van Rijn would help to recover stolen art. For this he was shot at and chased, a bullet even went clean through his leg. But he maintained his new cause. Which makes it strange, especially considering the information I have found about Van Rijn is all available on the internet and dated in the early 2000s, that someone from Antwerp, an old art dealer, would approach Van Rijn over the potential sale of objects of the Third Reich in January 2014. The dealer we will call D emailed Van Rijn.
Hello, Michael. I've made direct contact. My customer turned down the offer because there is too much baggage involved. However, I think it is exactly the right thing for you. We have to pay €1.5 million, so a discount won't be possible. You need to act quickly. Call me, D.
In the email, there is also a colour brochure attached. One of the pictures within shows the Taurus horses. So Van Rijn responds.
Very important. You have to know who the owner is, and you need to be 100% sure.
D responded in kind that the owner was a well-known family by the name of Flick, related to Friedrich Flick, a convicted Nazi war criminal who, unsurprisingly, after the war was honoured by the Adenauer regime in 1963. For more about the Adenauer and the Nazis, see our He Who Holds the Devil series. The Flick family was apparently trying to sell everything to do with the Nazi regime. A passable cover story. D wanted Van Rijn to contact him as quickly as possible about the sale, but Van Rijn had learned to be cautious and to take his time to ponder these matters. A few days later, he phoned another man, Arthur Brand, a Dutch art historian based in Amsterdam. Now there were two investigations on the case of the missing art, but neither knew of the other searching in unison. It was Brand who had the head start, however. Despite finding out about the horses later, he had a direct contact in the form of D. Brand is a modest man and makes his money through his work as an art consultant, paying for his investigations into missing artwork from his own pocket. He has recovered, to date, an estimated $250 million worth of stolen art, including Oscar Wilde's ring that was stolen from the Magdalen College in Oxford. Although in this case, when the ring was recovered, Oxford University decried it as a forgery. It wasn't. Brand bided his time, not wishing to scare D by jumping on the case too quickly. It gave him time also to bring in a new player. This time it was an American by the name of Moss, who, according to a highly respected firm of lawyers, had the not-so-modest bank balance of $250 million at his disposal. Moss was a collector of art, especially art that fell into the grey area of the Third Reich. Brand reached out to Dee, stating he had a client in the US highly interested in art produced during the Third Reich. Dee responded that he might just have the perfect items. Dee sent the brochure, and there were the horses, now with a price tag of €8 million. The two arranged to meet. By this time, the paths of Allonge and Brand had crossed, and now the two had agreed that they would work together. Neither wanted glory, only to do what they considered to be the right thing. When Dee and Brand met, it was at an unassuming George W.P.A. restaurant in Amsterdam. Brand had a colleague nearby to photograph the meeting at a distance, and he himself wore a buttonhole camera to record the entire conversation. Dee carried forward on the cover story that he had first told Van Rijn in the email, that there was a wealthy family wishing to offload its National Socialist past by the sale of the items that had been collected by the elder members of the family. Dee pushed Brand forward to make a decision by saying that there was a never-interested party, a retired US Army general, but Brand insisted his buyer was interested. Dee had a caveat: the money had to be processed through his Swiss company. Brand said it wasn't a problem. The two met again a few months later. By this point, Brand had informed Allonge, who in turn had looked into this so-called flick. It seemed, however, it wasn't the flick of war crime fame, but rather another one, who was famous for having a panther tank in an underground garage beneath his home. In the run-up to the second meeting, Dee had been dancing around the topic of the Torek horses. Instead, he had offered a golden fountain pen with a swastika upon it, a Hitler's Mercedes, Brecker reliefs, amongst others. Brand claimed interest on part of Moss. At this point, Dee asks if the money can be paid through Monaco instead of Switzerland. Brand says, of course. But for Allonge, the dithering was going on too long. It seemed as if there was not meant to be a sale of the horses, rather it was a way to attract new buyers to a business, buyers like Moss. The only thing was that Moss never existed. He had been entirely concocted by Brand. Allonge, impatient now, orders a raid, rather than wasting any more time. On the 20th of May 2015 at 12 noon, the raid begins, in Bad Dürkheim and in Kiel. At the property of Flick, the panther tank is discovered, as well as what might well be Arno Brecker's Wehrmacht from Hitler's Chancellery. Flick on the day of the raid was more than happy to state that it was rescued in pieces from a scrapyard, and he purchased it legally. The panther tank he had purchased in England, and it was partly rebuilt. The weapon naturally was not in working order. Nevertheless, the police seized it, bringing in a truck to cart it away. In Bad Dürkheim, the Torek horses were uncovered in the unassuming warehouse on an industrial estate and taken away to a secure storage facility, but only after the roads were checked to make sure they could bear the weight of the bronzes on trucks. Reina Wolff, who owned the Torek horses, quickly launched a challenge. Meanwhile, the horses were taken away, and a new discourse over their artistic value began within Germany. Arguments circled that they were not art because they belonged to the National Socialism movement of monumentalism, and therefore they had little value artistically. Discourses also circled over who should display them. Berlin's Topography of Terror said they would take one for one season. The others said the German Historical Museum should have them and provide context, but ultimately they were not shown and still have not been put on public display. It is not for me to say who owns them. That is for the courts that ruled in 2019 with new rules on asset recovery because of this case. But it is an interesting situation. Wolff bought the works officially as scrap, but the Federal Republic claims them as their own, despite the fact they were in East Germany on a Soviet Union military base. But the Federal Republic claims them as part of the unification treaty that brought the two Germanys together. Wolff was cleared of any wrongdoing earlier this year. The Federal Republic still holds on to the horses. Wolff also writes on his short and very dedicated website to the horses that he has reached out to the Federal Republic with a very sensible offer, to which they have not responded. According to the most recent press, it is more and more likely that it will go to trial. For the meantime, therefore, the horses remain, as they have done, bar the brief moment that they rode out from that warehouse in 2015, in the dark. Or does it? In the first part, you may remember that I said there were 3 horses. One was exhibited at the Große Deutschland Kunstausstellung, which caught the attention of Hitler in 1939, inspiring Thorak to create 2 more, which in turn he gifted to the Führer. So what happened to the third? At the end of the war, Thorak escaped any prosecution and was allowed to continue as an artist, the tribunal deciding that Thorak would have been a great artist with or without Hitler. He returned to the town of his childhood, where his mother was buried, and held solo exhibitions, receiving a few contracts in Salzburg. In 1949, Thorak took the pieces he had made for the exhibition in Paris in 1937 to a foundry and had those melted down. 3 years later, he suddenly died, leaving his estate to his wife, Erna Thorak. It was Erna Thorak who settled a debt with the Ising am Chiemsee boarding school, which their son had attended. In 1961, settling the debt by gifting the third and final, but original Thorak horse to the school. There it was displayed publicly, but nobody came looking for it until the other 2 were brought to light. Still today, you can wander Berlin and find many examples of Thorak's art, both from the times preceding Hitler's dictatorship and those from the period of the Third Reich, but sometimes history is a way of surprising you. In 2015, the same year that the horses were rediscovered, workmen in Gdansk, Poland, formerly Danzig, were digging in the garden of the Polish National Museum. As they dug down, they hit something hard. Clearing the soil away with their hands, a man's face began to appear. The more they cleared, the more features came into view, and before they knew it, they were staring into the face of Hitler himself. A giant bust, carved by Thorak in 1942, of the German dictator for an SS exhibition in Salzburg, had somehow ended up in the ground in Gdansk, perhaps buried as the German people fled the town from the Soviet advance, but is now on display in the National Museum in Gdansk. Thank you for listening to Achtung History. Researched, written and presented by myself, Simon J. James, and produced by the Berlin Tour Guide. Visit the website at theberlintourguide.com/Achtung History to discover more and delve into the archive. Follow on Twitter and Instagram at Achtung History for the latest updates, and support Achtung History on Patreon at patreon.com/Achtung History to receive bonus content from as little as €1 a month.